following program on Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the aspects of equal participation in political and public affairs. Is there really true democracy until true inclusion is achieved? How can our nation better its outreach? A very good evening and thank you for joining us on yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we break down key legal concepts for the layman. Now, tonight's topic is something that affects you and me and everybody in this nation, and that's on political equality and public equality and inclusion. Now, what does this topic mean? Of course, we know that we go to the polling booths, we say we're a democratic nation, but really, are we completely democratic until we reach true inclusion? Are all our minorities and are all our groups being considered when it comes to the democratic process? Well, to speak about this extremely complicated topic, we have someone that I believe is the best person for the job, and that is Attorney at Law Sajini Wickramasinghe. Thank you very much, ma'am, for taking the time to speak to us today. Quite a packed discussion, but hopefully we'll get through most of it tonight. Well, a little bit of an introduction on Ms. Sajini. She is actually the Rapporteur of Discrimination at the Commonwealth Youth Human Rights and Democracy Network. So safe to say we're in the best hands when it comes to speaking about equality and inclusion in the democratic process. Before we go into the discussion, here is a bit of a breakdown on how exactly we're going to approach this topic. First off, we're going to be talking a little bit about the current context. What exactly does equality and representation and inclusion when it comes to the democratic process look like in Sri Lanka at the moment? Next, we'll talk about the international standards that Sri Lanka may have met, may have not met, what we have to make up for. And finally, we'll be talking about potential reforms and also the future of equality and representation in Sri Lanka.
Hello, I'm Apulivasana. I'm a business management student. My question is on equal participation. What does the current climate of inclusion look like in Sri Lanka?
All right, well, without any further ado, let's get right into the discussion, ma'am. There's a lot for us to completely unpack because it's not just one topic actually. It encompasses a lot of aspects, especially considering democracy in itself is a very complicated topic and process. So before we get into any of the complexities, how about we do a little bit of the basics right now? Could you please explain to us what the current state of equality and representation when it comes to the political process and the public aspects look like in Sri Lanka at the moment?
Yes, first of all, thank you for having me, Anuradhi. So in Sri Lanka, we are an electoral democracy. You might have seen recently there was this index where we see globally the democracy is declining, but Sri Lanka is also in a pathway to a full democracy, but we are still an electoral democracy. So yes, we do have elections and we do vote our representatives at elections, but the question is, are we having a full democracy? And in answering that, I'm going to focus on the representation side and kind of limit it to that. And there are so many issues to unpack when it comes to equality in representation. I mean, if we simply take a look at our parliament, the composition of it, we can see there are no women, there are no young people, adequate representation of these groups, and there are no adequate representation of disabled people, and it's the LGBTIQ people. So it is this kind of lack of representation. And for an example, until the independence, we had some sort of representation that was imposed on us by the British government. But afterwards, when we became kind of on our own, if you look at the parliament, the legislature's composition, we have only had 13 women in the parliament since independence up to now. And we have not been able to kind of go beyond that number, and that's highly concerning. Even if you look at young people, this is a very low number at the moment. And we have countries as New Zealand who has appointed like 21-year-old, and there are people around the world that more and more young people are getting involved with the political system. I wouldn't say this is an issue with the young people or the women or these other groups in Sri Lanka, because there are people who are interested, who want to get involved with the process, but there are inherent barriers within the process to kind of get in to the legislature or these decision-making bodies. So I think moving forward, we can kind of unpack those. What are these issues? And
exactly. Yeah. I mean, considering the target groups that are actually facing issues when it comes to having a voice, I'd say, especially in places of power like the parliament, it's completely necessary and essential that it truly reflects our entire demographic and our entire population, but that's not really being done at the moment. So I think it's important for us to understand. You mentioned that there are inherent difficulties and barriers when it comes to, approaching true inclusion for these minority groups. Actually, women are not even a minority in this country, but there is an issue on the core level. So could you please explain to us, ma'am, now we understand that there are certain processes that have tried to be implemented when it comes to promoting equality. What are the legislative aspects of that? Do we have that in place right now?
Well, I would say first, we do, in the parliamentary level, we do not have quota systems yet. At the local government, we do, and it has its criticism and it has its pros after implementation, but my personal belief is it's a very good system in place as an affirmative action to improve inclusive decision-making places. And if we look at the parliament, I think the youth quota bill is kind of getting tabled. I'm not sure at this point where it exactly is, but the youth quota bill was in place, and we also have, as a youth movement, some of us have met MPs and kind of pushed them to pass the youth quota bill, but also we have a serious need for a women's quota bill too. The need for these quotas or need for this kind of affirmative action, I mean, there are a lot of, as I said, criticisms and questions about these quota systems, but the basic idea about affirmative actions is these are temporary. They're not supposed to last forever. Once the numbers have kind of got into the place, they have the possibility to remove the quota so that it can naturally kind of adjust to the system. So that is kind of a misconception about quota. These are, some people say that, okay, this is discriminatory, but positive discrimination is kind of accepted in our constitution itself under Article 12. So it's not about discrimination, it's about kind of, given that they're systematically discriminated for a long time, so you need that kind of extra push or special treatment or special legislation to bring them to that level. So that's what we need right now. We need quotas, because for this many years since independence, if we cannot really put more than 13 women to parliament, we have a serious issue. And if we cannot do it on our own as voters, I think we need a quota system to kind of balance that.
Right, there has to be a little bit of push, a bit of an injection before it can normalize and become the status quo.
Yes.
Speaking about the marginalized groups in our country and the inclusivity issue, where do you, in your opinion, ma'am, where do you see the most underrepresentation when it comes to these target groups? Where do you think is the most invisibility?
I would say all. Because I have worked with women in politics, young people in politics. I have worked with other groups such as disabled groups. So if you look at the parliament, it's very male-centric. So yes, it has an older men even in that category.
There is a specific criteria that fits.
That we can see. If we categorize, we can see the bigger number where does it reside. So there is a huge problem of most of the marginalized groups. When it comes to, I'm not even going to like the nuanced marginalized groups, because there are still disabled women, disabled Tamil women. There are there are so many different groups, but if you look at overall, I think especially women, young people, disabled, LGBTIQ, we have not even kind of approached in the status quo of Sri Lanka. We're far away, but at least, the youth and the women, if we can kind of bring them to the discussion, I think that would be a huge success.
Right. When it comes to the legal aspects as well that we just spoke about, you said that the quota system is actually necessary, just even if it's for a preliminary introduction for these groups in order to finally normalize and actually have true equity and equality. Do you think that there are any recent legal reforms or any other reforms, not constitutional, but other reforms that you see that's happening that is actually beneficial and moving in progression towards inclusion? Have you seen anything of the sort?
Yeah, in Sri Lanka, the regulation of the election financing, which was enforced in January, I think it's a very good legislation, even though there are some criticism towards it. I think as a beginning towards this equalizing the political space and accountability and that path, this is a very good start, even though we have a long way to go. But I think that's a good start. I think in terms of Sri Lankan context, it's a good start to that particular area. But I also want to kind of mention the right to equal participation in political affairs and public affairs. It's a niche when you look at the rights area in general, and it comes under civil and political right, but it is part of the ICCPR, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Sri Lanka has ratified in 2005, and we brought in the domestically enabling legislation in 2007. So we are, as Sri Lankans, we are supposed to have all those rights in the ICCPR as well, and we can hold the state liable if they are not being granted. And so this is a very interesting right, and it ensures that we have inclusive democracy. And I feel like I did my research on this area as well. I believe it's a very strong tool of empowerment, having that right to equal participation in political affairs, because in Sri Lankan context we mostly see it as a privilege than a right. Not many people see, okay, yes, I have a right to be a candidate. I have a right to run for politics. I have a right to become a candidate. So this kind of that right-based approach is not there yet in Sri Lanka for when it comes to political affairs. But if we, as I said, that having that kind of finance regulation when it comes to campaigning, it's a good start, so that it kind of can equalize the place. But I think we need more people to kind of see it from a rights-based approach rather than a privilege, or this is just for a particular group.
Right, exactly. It's not that you get to run, but it's that you are entitled to run. Absolutely. Whichever way to represent whichever faction you would want to represent. But of course, as you mentioned, it's quite a privilege-based approach that we see. It's a very select few that actually even have thoughts or actions that lead to political representation in any sense. Yeah. So, but that's actually a very interesting aspect, because the ICCPR, we have ratified it. But do you see at least a little bit of an increase in actually implementing these legislatures? Do you see individually? Well, we don't see it, but as a society, have you seen such sort of empowerment grow in the community?
I would say there's seriously more discussion within the civil society and NGOs empowering more women, more young people to join politics and kind of having trainings, leadership trainings. These kind of platforms, I think they have increased. But yet the issue is with, can they really get nominations and get into the political race or come into the mainstream politics? They can get trained, they can go into all these camps and all that, but afterwards, can they really become a nominee? That is the issue. And
we should, in your opinion, we should be facilitating that process, or do you believe that it's just a free-for-all?
I think we should. I mean, yes, through quotas. And one thing I also want to mention is the democratization of the political parties. We can't make the parties too rigid, because that is violative of the democracy itself. We cannot impose heavy regulations on political parties. But even the fact that having democratic parties, making their own decision-making process more democratic, selecting candidates more democratic, and even having the very fact that giving the national seat that list to the ones who really to fulfill the purpose of having the national list, having people who would not rather run the election race, do not have that capacity or do not have that kind of what it takes to run the election, just give them if they are qualified for that, not for the defeated candidate. So I think we can start from very simple changes, but I think I do see a change when it comes to civil society in terms of how women, young people, these groups are mobilized and trained. They are more aware, they are more empowered, but the problem is they remain empowered without an opportunity actually to get into these decision-making bodies.
And considering we're in the age of information, everybody, has the right to know, does know, and is knowledgeable about the fact that they have these rights and these empowerments, but nobody's really acting on implementing or even utilizing the rights that have been given to us by these conventions and these laws. Well, we do have quite a bit more to get into. Unfortunately, time has run against us in this segment. We still have to continue. I still have to ask you, ma'am, about the key challenges that you believe that women and of course other minority groups really face. We just spoke about it in the beginning as well. There are certain specific issues that prevent the process of participation and running. But before we do that, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. Stay with us.
Hello, my name is Sajini and I'm a business student. My question today is on international standards. Can Sri Lanka meet the expected requirements for a true democratic process?
Welcome back. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We were in discussion with Attorney at Law Sajini Wickramasinghe, and we were just talking about a very momentous segment. I think a good introduction into our discussion, but we still have quite a bit more to unpack. Specifically, I feel like this is the core, one of the cores of this discussion, and that is on the obstacles. Before we go into the international aspects, I'd like to ask you, you just mentioned when we started off that there are specific issues that actually cause these marginalized groups to be prevented from going forward in the chain, in actually putting it into fruition. So could you please explain to us what are some of these key challenges that are faced by some of these groups?
Yeah, of course. The first is not having the proper legislations to kind of have them into these decision-making bodies. One, I would say the election financing. I mean, we have something introduced, but we need to actually put into work and see whether it functions properly when the elections are coming. There are so many socioeconomic issues at the moment too. I cannot speak for all the groups and everyone in general, but some of the key issues that I've faced is there's so much stereotyping, stigma and harassment of especially women that are even interested in running for elections, and that seriously discourage them. It doesn't always mean it's from other parties, but even from their own parties there could be this kind of harassment and stereotyping and undermining of women candidates. And even youth, the young people, you can often see that the existing politicians or existing members of parliament would have more young people within their campaigning process, but would not be given the opportunity when it comes to actual representation or within the decision-making body. So it's more of tokenism, where the youth or these other groups are used as tokens to kind of show, okay, yes, we are inclusive, but they're not really inclusive. So I think that is one of the main issues. And just simply, if I talk about the disabled groups, not simply these spaces being accessible, I think that's a huge issue if we look at the entire structure, the system of Sri Lanka, how accessible it is. So I think there are so many issues like that systematically kind of discourages them. But also, on the other hand, we need to empower people more and educate people more, giving this right-based approach to political participation. I mean, we as young people have been doing some groundwork on that, kind of having these in-person sessions, awareness sessions, but we need more rights-based approach to it, rather than, as I said, looking at it from this sacred space for few people. No, it's for all of us. It's a democracy. All of us are eligible to be part of it. And also it's very interesting now when it comes to this equal participation in political affairs. The OHCHR has actually identified it to be a cyclical approach to democracy rather than not something that should be considered only in an election. Throughout the election year, throughout one election to the other election, it's a perpetual process. It's not a one-time thing. So that is also very interesting, because most of us, we just go and vote and that's it. But that's not about it at all for a democracy. You need to hold your representatives accountable. You need to ask them questions. You need to have public debates. You need to be a more active citizen within a democracy. And we need to change that perspective, that it's not just going and crossing off the ballot paper, but there's so much more when it comes to democracy, so much more that you can do just as a citizen, even if you don't want to run for an election.
Right, the democratic process is not just going to the polling booth,
Yeah.
it's actually continuing. It's not a one-way street. We have to keep holding our representatives accountable, and we have to keep being knowledgeable and in the know when it comes to our representatives as well. But I feel like a lot of us, we don't have that. We just, during the election season, we all have this entire craze. Who are we going to vote for? Is this good? Is that good? As an individual. But then you completely forget about it once the elections are over, and you just do not consider the democratic process at all. But actually we're all part of that process throughout. As you mentioned, it's cyclical. But you just mentioned, ma'am, when it comes to the aspects of the obstructions to the democratic process and actually being able to represent despite the background, despite the region, when it comes to the economic factors, I feel like that plays a huge role when it comes to even just considering. Of course, that's why we have the whole, it's a select few that get to run and a select few that get to have the privilege to represent. How do we actually combat that? Because that is a factual issue, and it's like at the end of the day, we can't really completely change somebody's economic class overnight. It's a very long process. How do you think we should be addressing this?
Well, again, we need very much systematic legal provisions and laws to kind of regulate that space. You can't heavily regulate it because again it's democracy, but you need, as I say, more transparency, more accountability. That's why I said we need to really put into the election regulation, campaigning regulation, and see whether the finance law actually works. How does it, because I saw there are many criticism towards it too, that there's no particular commission, it's the election commission that has powers over it. So there are issues like that. So we need more comprehensive laws when it comes to tackling that economic barriers when it comes to running for politics. And again, the other method is using the national seat. I mean, that list is there to kind of facilitate these kind of individuals, but who are actually qualified. So there are measures in place already in some way to kind of support this equalization process, but they are not really used for that purpose. So we need more laws, we need better regulations for financing, campaign financing, we need better regulations for accountability, not just during election but even afterwards, because it's a cycle. Someone gets appointed, someone gets elected to the parliament. Because of lack of accountability, you can become corrupt, earn billions, millions, and then again you have more money for run for the next election. So having more accountability, that's also a huge, and more transparency, that's a huge part of actually ensuring that we are equalizing the space economically.
And do you believe, ma'am, just a question of curiosity, the whole regulation, transparency and accountability aspect, if we succeed when it comes to promoting diversity and inclusion and actually having a parliament or having a power authoritative body that's reflective of our society, do you believe that transparency and all those other issues that we have will actually, domino effect and try and solve itself? Do you believe that there is a specific issue there? I feel like it's a can of worms, but just in your capacity, if you could answer.
Here's the interesting thing about democracy. I'm a huge believer in democracy, but also you cannot predict whether a democracy is successful or you can't predict it with any sort of governance. But the thing is, the good thing about democracy is if it doesn't succeed, if the rulers are not successful, you can remove them. They are not there forever, right? So it's again up to the voters. It's your power to vote people, even with regulation, even with all the laws, even with the perfect candidates. We still can have corruption. We can still have that kind of not ideal rulers. But I think the point being that it's not perfect, but when we have that kind of democracy, when we have that the ultimate level of freedom for the people to get involved with the system, get involved with their representatives, I think they can hold them accountable and remove them even if they don't act according to the laws and regulations and all that. So that is the beauty of democracy, that holding accountability. So I think, no, I don't believe that it will solve all the issues, but it will solve some of the important issues, I believe, at least to some level. Yeah.
Something is better than nothing.
Yeah.
It's always a start, right? Before we go into the future aspects and reforms, I think we should be focusing on what the segment was initially supposed to be about, which is the international aspects. I believe we have possibly the best individual when it comes to discussing that, considering your background, especially, ma'am, when it comes to the international standards that have been set for equal participation and right to participation. Do we see at least most of it being reflected in Sri Lankan standards, especially in the legal framework, or do you believe there is room for much change?
So when it comes to international standards and obligations, as a standard, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Article 21, it reflects that everyone has a equal right to participate through elections, through being a candidate. It's a very general form of right that's recognized, but it's more descriptive in Article 25 of the ICCPR, so where they look at you have the right to be a candidate, you have a right to freely elect your representatives and also be part of public affairs. So it's more elaborative in the ICCPR, and also there are a number of human rights council resolutions, around I think 4, that really elaborate what this really means, equal participation in political and public affairs. And there they talk about the importance of having quota systems as affirmative actions to make these spaces equal. And there are some more OHCHR expert recommendations or expert opinion on how this right can actually be exercised when it comes to the state level. And so Sri Lanka is definitely ICCPR, we are party to it, and the UDHR applies to Sri Lanka as well. And so we do have a responsibility to kind of recognize this right of individuals. And even in our constitution, if I kind of transform that to the Sri Lankan context, we have the right to equality in Article 12. And so you can very much use that right. But the thing is, there are many case laws, if I kind of go to that say that the state is not prevented from having a quota system, but also not imposed, like forced to have a quota system as well. So this is discussed in some cases. So if you look at the Ramu Pillai versus Pereira, or even Palihavarana versus Attorney General, which is the first the fundamental rights case after 1978 Constitution. So they all look at this aspect of having that positive discrimination or positive inequality to kind of equalize the platform, and to the importance of that, even Seniviratna versus University Grant Commission. So these are some important cases that have actually looked at the importance of having that that kind of special regulations or special mechanisms to equalize the space. But these cases are not really on the political space. They are not about the political equality. These are about socio-economic, like the jobs, education, right to education. So these are not really about the political space. So we don't have an case, or the Sri Lankan case, that really talk about expressively about this right. But there was one case, I think the Provincial Council Special Provisions, there was a case where the Supreme Court identified that some provisions of this particular law violates the right to equal treatment of the candidates. So that is, they kind of recognize there's a right for candidates to be treated equally. So that's a very important, I think, milestone. But again, there are not many cases that talk about this space. So we do not see it being discussed a lot. On the other hand, the other issue is, say, we can hold the state accountable. For an example, if it is done through administrative executive action, we can hold them accountable, but not really if it is within a political party. You can't hold them accountable through the fundamental rights mechanism system in Sri Lanka. So there are issues like that. There are lack of kind of holding parties accountable really for that particular action. So there are issues like that. What we can do locally is to maybe influence parties more to be democratic. So for me, what I actually found out from my research as well, parties have the most responsibility when it comes to equalizing the political space, because they are the ones who nominate. They are the ones who give opportunities to candidates after being nominated to talk here, talk there. So even if you are a nominee, that kind of discrimination can happen within parties when it comes to giving opportunities. And when it comes to giving party responsibilities, there could be discrimination, and there is discrimination, as I found out. So parties play a huge role when it comes to equalizing the space. So it's rather than what's the responsibility of the government. So government definitely can bring quotas, can bring election financing regulations, but parties play a huge role when it comes to equal participation in political affairs, and they are, for me, I think they are the main actor there. They have the biggest responsibility, and they need to ensure that they are making their spaces more inclusive, and they are diverting from this traditional family-oriented or this political dynastic political culture that we have built up. I think it's up to the parties to really democratize this space.
Right. There is quite a bit more for us to do, but there is a framework that we can follow, and we have to, as you mentioned, start from the unit, start from the parties before we can actually have individuals take accountability. We need to have the groups that are actually bringing the individuals together to actually give a proper platform, an equal platform to people that are willing to, and it's not just people that are deserving of a nomination of any sort. Well, unfortunately, we have come to time in this segment. I still do have to just poke your brains a little bit, ma'am, about the standard that Sri Lankan democracy and the right to participation is on a scale of the international governments that we've seen. But before we get into any of that, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Amani and I am a business student. My question is on future plans. How can Sri Lanka improve on existing criteria for future improvement of inclusion?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in our final segment in discussion with Attorney at Law Sajini Wickramasinghe. Ma'am, thank you very much for the past two segments. I believe our viewers learned quite a bit about the process of democracy in itself. It's not just a word, it's not just something that's attached to the front of our nation's identity. It is our identity when it comes to the aspect of individualism. Democracy is essential. We were just speaking about the international aspects of and how it translates to Sri Lankan democracy and the right to participation specifically. I think before we go into the reforms and future aspects and also to get a little bit about what exactly your work has been like in this field, considering how involved you are in this process, the international level, how do we see Sri Lanka's standings when it comes to the rest of the nations of the world? Are we better off, on the better side? Are we worse off? How does our democracy look like at the moment?
At the moment, we are an electoral, I'm talking statistically, we are an electoral democracy, and for past, I think within the decade, our democracy has actually increased or it has improved. The level of democracy, so there are certain indicators that they look at, the freedom of expression, the right to equality, and there are certain indicators that they look at. So compared to the past decade, we have improved. But also within the COVID times, there were certain concerns within the international community about the democracy of Sri Lanka, the democracy levels of it. And Sri Lanka had, I think, as I remember, in 2021, Sri Lanka was noted as the fast decline in democracy within that year, when it especially regarding the freedom of expression and that particular side. I think this was researched by NDI, and there are some concerns about it, but overall, if you look at the entire period, the decade, the Sri Lanka has improved. But as Sri Lankans from within, we know there are serious issues when it comes to democracy, especially when it comes to ensuring human rights, expression, arbitrary arrests, and those kind of areas. There are some serious issues right now. So but if you look at from the bird's eye, it has improved, but there are some serious issues. So electoral democracies, you recognize the country to have free and fair elections, but yet not other aspects of democracy being fully ensured. But the problem is, even if you look at the full democracies in the world, there are some serious issues. So we cannot really ensure, okay, this country is democratic just by looking at these indicators or scales. We need to really look at, do they really follow the values and principles of democracy? I feel like it's a very inherent kind of a value that we need to have. It's also a value that the people should have. If you want to live in a democracy, you need to kind of appreciate democracy for what it is. If you really want to live in a democracy, you cannot just only expect it from the ones in power or the decision makers. You need to be okay with, and democracy means that it's also ensuring minority rights. These are serious and important components of democracy. It's also about rule of law. It's also about separation of power. So these, you should be okay with these kind of components of democracy if you really want to live in a democracy, and you need to kind of familiarize yourself with these components. And I would say that Sri Lanka we have a long way to go, but it has gotten better if you compare to like 10 years back.
Right. I mean, from a bird's eye view, as you mentioned, there has been a promotion, a growth of democracy in the country, but that doesn't mean we need to get complacent as individuals and just completely ignore the democratic process because we think the trend is positive, so it will be positive. That positivity should come individually from us holding others accountable and also participating in a democratic process. As you mentioned, it's not a true democracy until on an individual level we see that it's a democratic value that's being upheld. That actually leads me very well to my next question when it comes to specifically you, ma'am. Could you please tell us now, as an individual that is very involved in this entire environment, in this entire conversation, could you tell us about the work that you have been doing that's actually translating into the Sri Lankan context or even the international context?
Of course. So our main idea as young people is giving education and awareness to the public, especially to the youth. And that is the main area that we have been working on. We have done advocacy training, we have done training on civic engagement, human rights, so the young people know what these are. And it's not just telling, okay, this is there on the constitution, but actually telling them what is the importance of having right to equality and kind of instilling that value. This is you looking at everyone as equal, considering all the communities, everyone, you see them as equal. So it's not just telling people these are your rights, this is democracy, but kind of putting those values into their mindset so that they actually can lead a life even in the other contexts being democratic. So that's the kind of work that we are doing. We do trainings, we do awareness sessions, but also I have represented personally in different international platforms, such as the World Economic Forum annual meeting that happened in Davos this year, where there were several sessions on equal participation in political affairs, and it was a huge topic there. It was not huge as AI or other topics in the world right now, but it also had huge traction because this year is a huge election year. 4.2 billion people around the world are voting this time at national elections. Yes, well. So that's why this year is very important for democracy, and that's why it was a big topic at the WEF24 as well. And there were serious concerns about how even in this context freedom of expression can be tackled, how the governments can kind of use violations of rights to violate this democratic process and kind of impede this democratic process. And there were a lot of discussion around it, and how people should look at the policies of the people, the rulers, or the policies of the candidates, especially when it comes to are they concerned about climate change, which is a big topic right now. Are they concerned about accountability, transparency? Are they concerned about technological development? Are they concerned about the economic aspects? So looking at these things, so that was also discussed when they were talking about the democracy as well. And I have also kind of engaged with as I'm part of the Commonwealth Youth Networks. I was there last year at the Commonwealth Youth Leaders Summit, and there we had a panel discussion with some of the foreign ministers from the Commonwealth countries, where it was kind of a dialogue between the foreign ministers and the young people. We were telling them what can their countries do better to include young people. And it's not just being tokenistic about the youth in politics. It's not just having young people to portray to be inclusive, but really considering them as equal stakeholders, considering they also add value to the process. We may lack years of experience, but we also have the knowledge, we also have the expertise in our own areas, we also have better view of certain things, we can think outside the box, we are more aware of certain issues, we are more concerned about certain issues as climate change, wars that are ongoing in the world. So we have that particular kind of special input that we can bring into decision-making process. So that was a really good dialogue that we had with different ministers from other Commonwealth countries. And so likewise, there are different international platforms that myself and there are many other young people from Sri Lanka as well, and regionally, that we have constantly worked with the government, states, other stakeholders to kind of improve this equal participation in political affairs, and also kind of talk about the issues that we share. I mean, especially when it's a regional discussion, there are many democratic issues that countries share and kind of we have faced similarly. So discussing things like that and finding solutions. So there are many platforms that talk about it. But I think that Sri Lanka actually has a lot of young people, a lot of women, very as I said, like they're more empowered, they want to talk about this, but again, it's about, if you really look at how it's translated to the mainstream, there are many issues still, especially there's so much stereotypes, so much stigma, when you actually look at the people talking about these issues. I mean, in the grassroots level or ground level within our civil society, we talk about equality, we talk about non-discrimination. But when we go and sit at a table with other decision makers, you really feel that kind of stereotype, that stigma that coming towards you. I think a lot of young people alongside me, we fight towards destigmatizing and also breaking these barriers and kind of really showing the ones at decision making tables, we also belong here and you need to give us places and platform to be here. But I think there's a long way to go. It's not that easy, especially I mean, that's why also we mostly approach young people too. It's easy to have that conversation because when you kind of reach the older generations, there are instilled beliefs and certain aspects that can be very hard to change. So we as young people, it's very easy to work with other young people as well. They are more open to kind of ideas and discussions and having talking about the having difficult conversations. So I think there are a lot of young people doing that job right now in Sri Lanka, but we have a long way to go.
Right, the uncomfortable conversation that eventually needs to happen in order for growth and progress. It is happening, just specifically we see the youth engaging more in that aspect. I think that actually leads me to a very good question of curiosity that I have. Ma'am, you mentioned that the youth are, stating, look, we deserve a seat at the table. We deserve to actually be part of these discussions in order to actually, promote true inclusion, true democracy. But I'd like to ask you, internally, have you seen, as you are working with them on a grassroots level, do you see issues, do you see conflict among the youth when it comes to going in a certain direction? How have you approached that?
Well, I wouldn't say there's conflict among youth. I can see now, but especially if you look at the political participation, there's a serious issue can be seen when it comes to young people sort of coming from the privileged background or certain political families that have better opportunity than the ones who are not. And I wouldn't say it's more of a fight or a conflict between those parties, because youth as a whole is not given that opportunity. Right. So they're kind of tackling it together.
Right.
But once inside,
we have to expand enough and get to the start line
first. So I think that's the way forward. But I would say that it's common having that kind of conflict, especially in the political spaces, but it's about having healthy conflict. So democracy is all about that. So it's having that space to that healthy conflict. And I think that's why I said it's about having that values and principles of democracy instilled in people, because I feel like right now some of those aspects are very new to Sri Lankans and us. We don't want to take up space. Yes, we are not familiarized with democracy yet, even though we have been living in a democracy for a long time. We are not really familiarized with the democratic mindset yet, even we have been living in a democracy for a long time. So I think that's what. So I think it's very interesting, and it's important to have kind of that healthy competition too. Especially in a democracy, it's about election is a competition.
Unless there's challenges, we won't really see any sort of progress. As well.
An election is a race, an election is a competition. So that is healthy, but we are asking for equality, and we are asking to these systemic kind of changes and equalization to make the race more equal.
Right. Yeah. Is there any specific reform that you believe lawmakers and people in power and authority, in positions of power and authority, should really be focusing on when it comes to the right to participation specifically?
Yes, I think the number one is quotas. We need quotas, and that's something many of us have been promoting for a long time, because as I said, we cannot see the women and the youth breaking the ceiling anytime soon. So it might take even 100 or 50 more years to kind of have that 50-50 or even 60-40 kind of parliament. So we need quotas, and I hope the youth quota bill gets approved, but we are in a serious need of women's quota bill as well. It may look like, oh my God, there are so many quotas, but it's required because we are struggling with a serious issue of inclusivity in our decision-making bodies, and a lot of countries have kind of tackled this. And also, it doesn't have to be a quota for the parliament seat itself. It could be a quota for the nomination list. So it has worked well in a lot of countries. So you don't necessarily have to give that kind of quota from the seats, but you can give in your nomination list a certain quota. And one issue that we always get when we promote quotas through media conferences or even any dialogue that we have is, are you asking us to vote women or young people who are not qualified or who are not accountable? But our simple message is that's not what we are asking for. We are simply saying voting for qualified people, voting for accountable people, voting for honest people, it's a basic rule, no matter what. So we are not saying, and that question shouldn't arise only when we talk about women and youth in politics as well.
Right, it shouldn't be weaponized.
It should be a question that you ask always when you vote someone, not only when we talk about women and
not when convenient.
youth or other groups in politics. So that's a question, and we do not question the older men in the parliament, and we do not hold them to the same standard that we would hold when we talk about women or youth in politics.
Especially when it comes to achieving democracy, there is no room for hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, the time we have with you today is coming to a close. We've had quite a packed discussion. Thank you very much, ma'am, for explaining to our viewers. I feel like our viewers are walking away with quite a bit of information and a bit more empowerment when it comes to their rights as to democracy and the right to participation. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you for having me, Anuradhi.
All right, well, equality is an aspect of human nature that is often overlooked. We must always strive to be better as a society, as a whole, and as an individual. We leave you tonight with the words of Harvey Milk, an American politician and activist. It takes no compromise to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual, and it takes no political deal to give people freedom. It takes no survey to remove repression. That is all we have for you tonight on Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed any of tonight's programs, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/OtherDerana English. Thank you for watching. Have a great night.